Live television was not prepared for what unfolded that night. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, calm, focused, and with nothing left to prove, came armed with evidence and resolve. But this time, her target wasn't a bill or a policy flaw. It was Melania Trump. And for once, silence wouldn't be enough to shield her. The show was set up like any other primetime political roundtable. For panelists, one moderator, and a network hoping for clean commentary and a few sound bites. Viewers across the country tuned in, expecting the usual political performance, predictable back and forth, talking points, spin. What they got instead was a confrontation that left the room breathless. The set was typical: polished backlit navy panels, high chairs, branded mugs that nobody ever drank from. Jasmine Crockett sat third from the left, wearing a sleek navy blazer and a quiet expression. For the first 20 minutes, she barely spoke. She listened, took notes, observed. Then the host steered the conversation toward political ethics, and the mood shifted. The camera turned to Melania Trump. Sitting directly across from Jasmine, the former First Lady looked composed, graceful, untouched by the tension. She did what she always did: answered vaguely, smiled politely, evaded precisely. The public had seen this version of her 100 times. But Jasmine leaned forward just slightly, enough to signal, "I'm not playing today." "Well," she began, voice calm but direct, "since we're discussing ethics, let's stop pretending that marrying into power erases accountability." The room held its breath. The host blinked. Melania tilted her head, still smiling. "I'm sorry," she said. "Was that meant for me?" Jasmine didn't blink. She reached in her bag, not dramatically, just deliberately, and pulled out a thick, organized folder. She unclipped it, placed it on the table, and began laying down pages. Transaction logs, offshore filings, court summaries. "These," Jasmine said, "are financial records, shell company filings, a suspended investigation out of upstate New York. All of them trace back, directly or indirectly, to your name." The silence was sharp. Melania looked at the documents. Her mouth opened, closed. She turned to the host, forcing a smile. "This is clearly a setup," she said. "I won't engage in conspiracy." "It's not a conspiracy," Jasmine replied. "It's a pattern, and it's documented." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply laid down fact after fact, like a lawyer delivering closing arguments. Behind the scenes, chaos broke out. Studio producers scrambled in the control booth. A red light blinked on and off above the host's desk. Someone handed a note to the moderator. But it was too late. Viewers were already recording, clipping, uploading. Within minutes, hashtags like hashtag Crockett versus Melania and hashtag Jasmine has receipts were trending. Melania tried to pivot. "I thought we were here to talk about America's future, not to dig up meaningless accusations from a decade ago." "With respect," Jasmine said, not breaking eye contact, "when those accusations involve hidden money and unaccounted influence, they are America's future." The moderator tried to intervene. "Let's stay on topic." "I'm on topic," Jasmine said. "The topic is accountability." Viewers at home sat stunned. No one had ever confronted Melania like this. Not with documentation. Not with a tone so unshaken. Not without blinking. And just like that, the story escaped the studio's control. But here's what most people didn't know. Jasmine had already accepted what might happen. 3 days before the show, she sat across from her chief of staff in a diner just outside Fort Worth, a quiet place where waitresses still said "hon" and topped off coffee without asking. She wasn't eating. She had a different folder in front of her. Not the one from the show, but the same trail. "This isn't just politics," her aide, Kenny Rowe, said. "You're going after someone they protect hard. You know that, right?" Jasmine stirred her coffee slowly. "Let them come," she said. "There's proof," she added. And people need to stop pretending she was just standing quietly on the sidelines. Kenny leaned back, concerned. "Sometimes proof doesn't protect you. Sometimes it gets you buried." She didn't respond. She had spent her entire career walking into rooms she was never meant to lead. A black woman from the south side of Dallas. No family legacy, no soft landings. "I'm not here to start a fire," she said at last. I'm here to show people it was already burning. Back at her apartment that night, Jasmine Crockett sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by documents. Every page had been checked, rechecked, and cross-referenced. Fraud reports, offshore transfers, corporate registrations, signatures, names misspelled, dates that didn't add up. The kind of inconsistencies most people wouldn't notice, unless they'd spent years reading the fine print. She didn't have everything, but she had enough. Enough corners to sketch out a shape. A story. There was one document in particular she kept coming back to, an offshore transfer tied to a shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands, made just months before Donald Trump launched his campaign. On paper, it looked clean, but the beneficiary listed on the account was a variation of Melania's name, spelled exactly as it appeared on earlier European legal filings, not her American documentation. She stared at it long enough for her eyes to burn. Then her phone buzzed. A message from a journalist friend in Pittsburgh. You're seriously going to do this on air? They'll call you unstable, unhinged. They'll twist everything. Jasmine typed back just 5 words. They always do, until they can't. The next morning, she reached out to someone she hadn't spoken to in years, Dolores Finney, a retired federal clerk who had passed her the Syracuse files long ago. Dolores was in her late 70s now, mostly off the radar, but sharp as ever. You sure you're ready to go public? Dolores asked over speakerphone. They've buried too much, Jasmine said. You know they scrubbed it. On purpose. There was a pause, then Dolores chuckled dryly. You've got more guts than half the folks I worked with at the DOJ. Jasmine smiled, but the weight was still there, heavy and familiar. Courage always had a price. You could feel the clock ticking every time you took a step toward the truth. When she finally walked into the studio on the day of the roundtable, her folder felt heavier than any briefcase she'd ever carried. Not in weight, but in consequence. This wasn't about political theater. This wasn't a viral moment waiting to happen. It was now or never. What no one saw before the cameras turned on was the moment Jasmine had with herself in the mirror backstage. Alone, quiet. No makeup artists, no press handler, just her reflection and the nerves that she'd trained to ignore. She looked herself dead in the eye and whispered the same 3 words she always said before stepping into something she couldn't take back. Tell the truth. She passed the stage manager. The countdown light flashed red. She took her seat, offered a polite nod to the guests, even to Melania, and waited for the moment. But she didn't see a first lady sitting across from her. She saw a wall of privilege and silence that had stood untouched for far too long. And Jasmine had already decided she wasn't going to be part of that silence anymore. But to understand what Jasmine was really up against, you had to go further back, beyond the glossy magazine covers and carefully crafted interviews. Back to the version of Melania Trump that the public was never meant to examine. Long before the White House, long before the media rebranded her as an enigma, Melania was just Melania'S from Sevnica, Slovenia. Her story had been told countless times. The rise from small-town obscurity to fashion runways to global recognition. But Jasmine had learned the hard way that stories like that are rarely told in full. She didn't care about the fairy tale. She wanted the footnotes, the edits, the omissions. It was one of her interns, a 24-year-old named Troy Whitman, who first brought her a stack of archived European business records. They'd been pulling documents from European trade registries, double-checking dates from Melania'S modeling years. There's something weird here, Troy said one afternoon in their cramped Capitol Hill office. She signed off on a patent filing in Zurich in 1998. Problem is, in every interview, she claimed she was living in the U.S. full-time by then. Jasmine leaned in. What kind of patent? Jewelry. Vague descriptions. But the paperwork trails off around 2003, which means she maintained business ties overseas long after she claimed otherwise. At first glance, it seemed harmless. Outdated filings, vanity patents. But Jasmine had worked enough financial crime cases to know what offshore structures were often built for, especially when the timelines didn't match the public narrative, especially when the records were quietly ignored. Then came the Pennsylvania connection. Troy found it late one night while running a search through regional court archives. a case filed in Allegheny County in 2006 under a nearly untraceable name, Melania'S Holdings. On the surface, it looked like a standard real estate dispute, but buried in the appendix was a sealed affidavit. The name redacted. The accusation? Wire fraud. It had been sealed under the broad phrase national interest. Jasmine blinked at the PDF Troy forwarded her. "You're sure this is real?" "Yeah," he replied. "Judge sealed it. Files don't show up unless you search by docket number." Someone buried it clean. She printed the appendix and circled the signature space. The signature wasn't there. Just a faded word, withheld. "She's got too many names tied to too many operations," Troy muttered. "Either she's laundering money, or she's the unluckiest businesswoman on the planet." That line stuck with Jasmine. She started building a timeline. 1996, early modeling career. 1998, Zurich patent filing. 2001, green card inconsistencies. 2004, boutique business registered under a cousin's name. 2006, shell company in Miami. No employees, one massive loan. It wasn't random. It was structured. Jasmine reached out to an old contact in Harrisburg, someone who used to work in the state's financial crimes unit. He agreed to look at the materials on the condition of anonymity. After reading through the files, his response was blunt. "Cover operation," he said. "Shells used to move small funds. Just under the radar. Not enough to grab national attention. Just enough to grease the right wheels quietly." "And the agencies?" Jasmine asked. "Why didn't they follow up?" He paused. Maybe they didn't see it. Or maybe they saw it, and someone told them to look away. That was what unsettled her the most. Not the possibility of misconduct, but the ease with which silence moved in when power was involved. Melania had spent years presenting herself as aloof, elegant, disconnected. The media painted her as distant, reluctant, refined. But Jasmine saw something different. The distance wasn't innocence. It was insulation. The more she dug, the more she realized Melania hadn't stumbled into privilege. She had learned how to hide behind it. There was a moment Jasmine kept returning to, a charity gala in Dallas back in 2012. She'd attended as a guest of a legal firm. Melania had been the guest speaker. She was on stage for less than 15 minutes, said a few words, took no questions, left through a private exit with two men who weren't listed in the event program. Jasmine had watched it from the back of the room. Even then, something felt off. "She's not untouchable," Jasmine said to Kenny one late night in the office. "She just moves like she is." "Then if you're going to pull her into the light," Kenny warned, "make sure what you've got is airtight." Jasmine held up a growing stack of pages. "I'm not here to speculate," she said. "I'm here to show the math." Once the files were strong enough to stand alone, she stopped teasing it. No leaks, no warnings, no whispers to the press. She waited. She planned. She chose her moment. And when that roundtable invitation arrived, she didn't hesitate. She didn't poll test her message. She didn't prep zingers. She packed the folder. Told no one, not even her comms team. Because when a system depends on silence, the most disruptive thing you can do is speak. What no one expected was how fast the reaction would spread. Because when Jasmine opened that folder live on air, she wasn't just confronting a person. She was pushing against an institution. One built on image, loyalty, and a polished version of the truth. And the moment she started flipping pages, it wasn't just Melania who felt the heat. It was everyone who had helped keep her untouched. Within hours of the broadcast, the video was clipped and reposted to nearly every major platform. First by political Twitter accounts, then watchdogs, then mainstream news, and finally, late-night comedians who turned Jasmine's calm confrontation into a viral monologue. But not everyone was laughing. Inside Mar-a-Lago, the footage played on repeat in a soundproof study, where Donald Trump paced with the remote in one hand and a clenched jaw. "She blindsided her," he told an aide. "That was staged. That was coordinated." His voice wasn't angry. It was cold. And that was worse. Melania sat silently in a white linen chair, her fingers curled tightly around the armrest. The calm demeanor she displayed on TV had vanished. She wasn't used to being challenged. Not like that. Not by someone who didn't flinch, who came prepared with names, numbers, and intent. For years, she had walked untouched through storms. She had let her husband absorb the attacks while she kept her distance, always elegant, always reserved. But Jasmine didn't come at her with gossip. She came with documents. And now, Melania knew. Her insulation had cracked. By morning, White House-aligned strategists were already scrambling to respond. Not with facts. They didn't dare revisit the claims, but with noise. Misdirection. They floated new headlines, pushed old controversies back into the spotlight, whispered to friendly outlets that Crockett was emotionally unstable, obsessed, playing the race card. It was an old playbook, but Jasmine didn't respond. Not yet. She knew silence sometimes worked better than defense. Let them scream into a void. Let them try to flip the narrative. She had learned in courtrooms that the loudest person was rarely the most prepared. Instead, she let the documents speak. That weekend, she quietly published a redacted version of the file she'd referenced, backed by public records and citation links. No commentary, no headline, just a single line. For public review. Facts don't shout. They just wait. By Monday, over 3 million people had read them. That was when the real backlash began. Not against Jasmine, against the silence. Journalists began reopening old stories they'd buried years ago. Local papers in New Jersey, Florida, even Slovenia began tracing timelines. A nonprofit investigative group launched a deep dive series titled The Invisible Empire, tracing the untouchable network. For the first time, Melania Trump became more than a side note. She became the headline. And Crockett? She didn't gloat. She went back to work. On Tuesday, she chaired a housing rights panel. On Wednesday, she introduced a bill increasing penalties for financial fraud in real estate markets. When asked if her recent exposure of offshore accounts influenced the bill, she smiled. I'm just trying to make sure the system stops rewarding secrets. At home, she still returned to the same cluttered apartment, the same microwave dinners, the same folder of documents. Now worn at the edges, the ink beginning to smudge from repeated handling. It was never about a takedown. It was about truth. And truth doesn't trend. It either sits in the shadows, or it makes people very, very uncomfortable. But while the political class bristled, something else was happening, something Jasmine didn't expect. The letters. They started as emails, then DMs, then handwritten notes. Dozens, then hundreds. From women in boardrooms, in schools, in kitchens. Women who had been told to be quiet, to be soft, to be grateful. Women who had never seen someone like Jasmine speak truth to someone like Melania, and mean it. One letter simply read, "Thank you for reminding me that power without truth isn't power. It's pretense." Another, "I've spent my whole life keeping my head down. Watching you made me want to sit up straight again." Jasmine read each one. She didn't respond to all of them, but she printed the first 50 and kept them in a drawer next to her bed. Because in a world that runs on noise, those letters reminded her why she had chosen clarity. And clarity, she knew, was a quiet kind of revolution. While public opinion continued to fracture, Jasmine Crockett stayed the course. She didn't hold press conferences. She didn't do late-night interviews. The work was never about attention. It was about accountability. And that work was just beginning. Inside Capitol Hill, reactions were mixed. Some colleagues offered silent nods in hallways. A few slipped her quiet words of encouragement behind closed doors. But others weren't so subtle. One senior senator stopped her in the elevator and said, without a hint of irony, "You really went for the jugular." Impressive. Dangerous, but impressive. Jasmine didn't respond. She learned that not every comment needed a reply. The real pressure came from the unseen places. Donors suddenly hesitant to fund her next initiative. Think tanks rescinding invitations. Staff members warned by their mentors to be cautious who you align with. It didn't surprise her. Disruption always invites discomfort. But what no one could deny was that Jasmine had shifted the room. Not just that night on live television, but every day after, by refusing to let the moment define her. By showing up and doing the work as if nothing had changed when everyone knew everything had. The media tried to bait her. "She's hiding," one headline claimed. She launched a missile. "Now she's in the bunker," another wrote. They were wrong. She wasn't hiding. She was rebuilding the stage. One document at a time. One policy meeting at a time. One voter conversation at a time. What Jasmine knew, what few in Washington truly grasped, was that change doesn't come when the spotlight is brightest. It comes in the quieter aftermath, when people are no longer watching, but listening. And someone else was listening, too. Melania. Behind the scenes, the former First Lady was no longer attending events. Her team declined interviews. Requests for comment were met with silence or carefully worded deflections. But inside her inner circle, panic was growing. The documents Jasmine shared had stirred more than public chatter. They had attracted the attention of 3 different investigative outlets, one of which had quietly partnered with a European firm to trace international financial transfers. The Trump family had weathered storms before, but not like this. Not one aimed so specifically. Not one with paper trails and timestamps. Not one without the usual dramatic flair to dismiss it as partisan theater. This was different, and Melania knew it. She wasn't just defending her reputation now. She was defending her version of history. Jasmine, meanwhile, turned her focus to mentorship. A group of interns, mostly women, mostly Black and Latina, began spending after hours in her office. She taught them how to track money, read filings, spot lies in legal language. This isn't glamorous, she told them. No one claps when you find a 2002 bank error. But truth lives in the margins. That's where they hide it. One of the interns asked her, "Do you think you'll ever be done fighting?" Jasmine smiled softly. "I don't think that's the point. The point was to make the fight visible, to show others how to read between the lines, to remind them that justice isn't found in grand moments. It's buried in the paperwork no one wants to look through." Meanwhile, in a quiet part of New Jersey, a woman named Carla Boskovic mailed an anonymous tip to a nonprofit reporter. Carla had worked in logistics for one of Melania'S early European companies, the kind that was officially closed but still maintained shell operations. Her letter was short. "There's more. The books don't match. I saw myself." She signed off. Check Geneva, 1999 to 2001. That tip cracked open another corridor of questions, and it all pointed back to what Jasmine had suspected from the beginning. The real story wasn't just about Melania. It was about a system designed to elevate silence, to protect those who never needed to speak. And Jasmine Crockett, she was done staying quiet. The investigation into Melania's financial past had now grown legs of its own. Jasmine Crockett wasn't driving it anymore. She didn't need to. The truth, once surfaced, didn't need a megaphone. It simply needed oxygen. And now it had it. The Geneva tip unlocked a new phase. Journalists found that a now-dissolved company, Artemis Mode SA, had listed Melania as a strategic consultant from 1999 to 2001. On paper, it was a Swiss-based luxury accessory line. But records showed no product sold, no physical inventory, no employees beyond a fax line shared with 2 other shell firms. The money trail? Nearly $2.8 million in transfers from various European accounts, all ending abruptly after September 11th. It was no longer about a former First Lady's quiet past. It was about financial systems, influence corridors, and the decades-long dance between politics and money. Melania released a statement through her spokesperson. "These allegations are politically motivated distractions. The former First Lady has always followed legal protocols and ethical standards." But the statement didn't name Jasmine, because to do that would legitimize her. And that's what shook them the most. Jasmine hadn't needed to shout, accuse, or grandstand. She had simply asked questions and brought receipts. While the news cycle spun, Jasmine stayed grounded. She was in Houston, meeting with community organizers about affordable housing policies. No cameras, no speeches, just policy folders, water bottles, and folding chairs in a school gym. Someone asked her if she felt like a target. She looked up from her notes. "I feel like a mirror," she said, "and they don't like what they're seeing." Meanwhile, in quiet corners of the internet, a new wave of supporters emerged. Not political diehards or campaign volunteers, but people who had lived in silence themselves. A retired accountant who once flagged suspicious filings at a firm now connected to Melania'S early ventures. A former roommate from Slovenia who recalled unusual cash deliveries. A fashion assistant who had shredded invoices without asking questions. They began submitting anonymous files, photos, signatures, wire receipts. And suddenly, Jasmine wasn't alone anymore. She had an invisible army, people tired of pretending not to notice. But while momentum built outside, internal pressure began mounting too. A call came from a speaker's office. Not accusatory, just concerned. "Congresswoman, we admire your diligence," the voice said. "But it might be time to consider the broader optics here. We're heading into a volatile election cycle." Jasmine exhaled. "Optics are for people managing impressions. I'm managing reality." Still, she knew what they meant. Power always wants containment, not explosions. But this wasn't a bomb Jasmine had thrown. It was a door she'd opened, and it wasn't closing anytime soon. In private moments, she wrestled with the weight of it. Her mother, now retired and living in Garland, called her every Sunday. It didn't talk politics. They talked recipes, childhood memories, bad movies. Her mother would pause at times, then say, "Just keep your light, baby." That's what they really wanted dim. Jasmine kept that close, because even as her public name surged, she knew fame was never the goal. Visibility wasn't safety. It was vulnerability in disguise. One morning, an envelope arrived at her office, no return address. Inside was a single note. "Be careful where you shine that light. Not everything wants to be seen." Jasmine held the letter for a moment, then tore it in half. She wasn't interested in warnings. She was interested in truth. Later that week, she gave a closed-door briefing to 3 congressional colleagues. She laid out what she'd found, the gaps in public records, the active tips still being vetted. One of them, a junior congressman from Oregon, leaned back in his chair. "This isn't just a scandal," he said. "This is a system, and it's deeper than one woman." Jasmine nodded. "It always is." That closed-door meeting triggered quiet ripples across Capitol Hill. No headlines, no leaks, but something shifted. The hallway whispers grew quieter when Jasmine passed. The usual political nods were replaced with purposeful eye contact or deliberate avoidance. The type of shift that told her the truth had started making people uncomfortable in places it wasn't meant to reach. Meanwhile, the files kept coming. Her office had to implement a new intake system. Anonymous tips now arrived daily. Volunteers helped vet them. Some were baseless. Others were half-formed. But a few had depth, real leads, real names, real trails. One email came from a compliance officer at a mid-sized New York bank who had reviewed archived internal audits. Subject line, "Possible foreign beneficiary discrepancy, 2002 filing." It linked Melania to an account created under a shell management trust. The problem? The beneficiary designation used a foreign address and failed to list U.S. tax status. Small detail, huge implication. Jasmine's legal instincts kicked in. This wasn't about morality anymore. This was about legal exposure. And that meant someone, somewhere, had lied under oath. She compiled the strongest pieces into a secure report and flagged it internally for ethics review. No press, no pressuring agencies. She followed procedure, because while her adversaries wielded chaos, she would answer with order. Outside the Capitol, the public narrative continued to bend. A major editorial in The Atlantic ran the headline, "Elegance, Silence, and Scrutiny, the Melania Trump Paradox." It didn't credit Jasmine directly, but it couldn't have existed without her. And the more op-eds appeared, the more the country split. Not cleanly, not neatly, but along emotional lines. To some, Jasmine was a troublemaker, a disruptor, a black woman who didn't know her place. To others, she was a truth-teller, a system challenger, a symbol that someone was finally willing to ask the questions no one else dared. But Jasmine didn't need the validation. She'd learned long ago that public praise was just as fleeting as public outrage. What stayed with her were the moments in between, the quiet acknowledgments, the whispered thanks, the courage she could feel growing in others. And that courage was spreading. College campuses began holding symposiums on political accountability and offshore transparency. Social media lit up with threads that decoded financial documents line by line. A group of law students in Chicago launched a website breaking down every corporate entity tied to the former First Lady's financial past, citing Jasmine's evidence as the foundation. This wasn't a wave. It was a current, and it was gaining speed. But currents, Jasmine knew, had consequences. One night, as she left a policy roundtable in Philadelphia, a car followed hers for 4 city blocks. No license plate, no lights. She didn't panic. She just texted Kenny. "It's starting." Kenny replied immediately. "I'm on it. Stay in motion." She circled the block twice, then drove straight to a local police station. The car peeled off. No confrontation. No license. Just enough to be noticed. The message was clear. Someone was watching. And Jasmine? She'd never been more certain of her path. The next morning, she showed up early to her office. She wore white. Not by accident. She sat at her desk, poured coffee into her chipped mug, the one that read, "I am the storm," and pulled out the next envelope. She opened it slowly, methodically, like she had 100 others. Inside was a copy of a 1997 European land transfer agreement. The buyer? A shell company once tied to a Slovenian family holding firm. The seller? A former campaign donor with ties to early Trump ventures. She looked at the signature line. It was faint, smudged, but legible. Melania'S. Jasmine placed the land transfer document atop the others. The folder was now almost too thick to close, but what it represented couldn't be sealed away again. She took a breath and turned to her window. The Capitol dome loomed just over the skyline, washed in soft morning light. It looked eternal, steady, but Jasmine knew better. Institutions were only as honest as the people willing to hold them accountable. And she was no longer interested in preserving appearances. She was interested in rewriting the rules. That afternoon, Jasmine met with her legal team, not for damage control, but to prepare for what might come next. If they file a suit, her counsel said, they'll claim defamation. "I never made a claim without evidence," Jasmine replied. "They'll say the dots you connected are circumstantial." Jasmine held up the latest document. Sometimes the only thing more dangerous than proof is the pattern it exposes. The team nodded. No one in the room questioned her judgment. They just braced for impact. Then came a call from 60 Minutes. They wanted an exclusive. Jasmine declined. "I don't want to perform this," she told her aide. "I want people to understand it." Instead, she released a detailed, open-source report. No branding, no spin, no summary quotes. Just scanned documents, verified trails, timelines, and footnotes. She titled it simply, "What We Know, and What You Deserve to Know." The report was downloaded over 6 million times in 48 hours. Melania's team went silent, but others did not. Legal experts began holding webinars to unpack the filings. Political historians cited the report in essays exploring power, gender, and silence. Even some conservative voices reluctantly acknowledged something wasn't adding up. And Jasmine, she kept going. She spoke at a community college on transparency in public office. She visited a senior center in Baton Rouge to talk about estate fraud protections. She responded to every email from young interns asking how to research financial filings. Because Jasmine had always believed that truth was most powerful when passed forward, not just broadcasted. One night, Kenny found her asleep on her couch, papers spread across her chest like a shield. He didn't wake her. He just placed a blanket over her and noticed the headline on her screen. "When Silence is a Luxury, Why We Needed Jasmine Crockett." He smiled, not because she'd won, but because she hadn't changed. And change was the one thing power never knew how to handle. Back in New York, a different kind of meeting was happening, quiet, discreet, and private. Melania sat across from 2 attorneys, her posture rigid. The walls of the room were lined with muted paintings and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. This wasn't a crisis team. This was a reputation shield. "They're circling," one attorney said. "It's not just public sentiment. It's legal exposure. If any of this connects directly to campaign finance." "It doesn't," Melania snapped. "Not yet," the second attorney said. "But it doesn't have to." All it takes is for someone credible to suggest it, and Crockett has already been deemed credible. Melania sat back, lips tight. "They don't know everything," she whispered. The room fell silent, because in that moment, her lawyers realized something critical. Jasmine hadn't guessed. She had scratched the surface of something real. And now, it was only a matter of time before the rest of it came to light. The cracks weren't just in the narrative, they were in the fortress. Behind closed doors, Melania's former staffers were now being approached by journalists, investigators, and watchdog groups. Some declined. Others hinted. A few opened up. One former personal assistant, speaking on background, described it plainly. She was always careful, but not because she was hiding something evil, because she was hiding everything. Her past, her deals, her intentions. It was all about control. Jasmine read the article 3 times. It wasn't vindication. It was validation. She didn't need Melania to fall. She needed the illusion to fracture, so others would stop mistaking silence for dignity and opaqueness for grace. But the deeper lesson came when Jasmine was invited to speak at a women's law symposium in Atlanta. She stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of sharp, young eyes. Not a single camera in the room. No press. Just future lawyers, advocates, changemakers. She didn't speak about Melania. She spoke about fear. About how fear doesn't always scream. It whispers. It tells you to wait, to soften, to shrink, to be careful. Especially if you're a woman. Especially if you're black. Especially if you know too much. Power doesn't ask you to be silent, Jasmine said that day. It expects you to be. And in that room, no one blinked. Because they all knew. Later, one student approached her and said, "It's not that I didn't think we could speak up. I just didn't think it would matter." Jasmine looked her in the eyes. "It always matters," she said, "even if they pretend it doesn't." By now, the Federal Oversight Committee had begun to raise quiet questions, not about Melania directly, but about long-dormant financial policies, disclosure loopholes, and real estate audits. Jasmine wasn't steering those discussions, but she had sparked them, and the ripple was becoming a wave. Still, the noise grew louder. A political PAC released an attack ad calling Jasmine divisive. Commentators questioned her motives, her tone, her obsession. One panelist asked on air, "Why is she so focused on Melania? Is this personal?" Jasmine didn't respond, because she knew the answer would only be twisted. It wasn't personal. It was precise. She found a thread and followed it. And what unraveled was never just about one woman. It was about every mechanism that had shielded her, every loophole that had been protected, every system that said, "Let it go." She hadn't gone looking for a villain. She'd gone looking for the truth, and that made her dangerous. One rainy afternoon, Jasmine walked into her office to find a small package on her desk. No return address, no postage, just a thick envelope neatly taped. Inside were 3 notarized documents, bank slips, a trust agreement, and one handwritten note. "You're not wrong, but be ready, they're not done fighting." The note wasn't signed, but the trust account matched one from her own file. The new detail? A connection to a luxury apartment in Prague, leased to a man who had served on Melania's early business boards. She slid the documents into her growing archive, cross-referenced the names, and quietly added one more node to her diagram. She didn't announce it. She didn't tweet it. She just kept going. Because the truth, once set free, doesn't need a shout. It only needs to persist. Months passed. The news cycle moved on. Other scandals surfaced. New headlines took center stage. But Jasmine Crockett never stopped. She kept showing up. Early mornings, long hearings, quiet weekends, poring over documents while the city slept. The camera crews had turned away, but she still held the receipts. One night, long after the Capitol lights had dimmed, she sat alone in her office, the city outside cloaked in shadows. She wasn't chasing glory. She wasn't planning the next move. She was reading, reviewing, remembering why she started. In her bottom drawer was a file marked Origins. It contained the very first printouts she'd ever collected, scribbled notes, yellow highlights, the first time she'd typed the name Artemis Mode. It wasn't about obsession. It was about clarity. Because sometimes the greatest threat to power isn't chaos. It's calm. It's precision. It's a woman who won't be distracted, won't be rushed, and won't be shut down. Across the city, in a private residence shielded from cameras, Melania Trump sat in her library. The news coverage had cooled. Her defenders had returned. Her reputation, though dented, remained intact among her base. But something had shifted, not publicly, privately, because she now understood the quiet ones were the ones you had to watch. Not the screamers, not the dramatics, the ones who came with timelines, receipts, truth. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew it. Jasmine had struck a nerve. And no matter how polished the surface appeared, something underneath had been cracked. Back on Capitol Hill, Jasmine opened a fresh notebook and began outlining a new initiative, one that would mandate full transparency for all foreign-linked financial disclosures involving political spouses. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't make headlines. But it was the kind of bill that changes how shadows operate. And that, she thought, is what they really fear. That truth will no longer arrive with fireworks, but with form, with structure, with the unshakable force of calm clarity. In a final interview, months after the viral moment, Jasmine was asked if she would have done anything differently. She thought for a second, then answered, "I wish I didn't have to be the one, but I'm glad I was ready when it was time." And with that, she stood, smoothed her blazer, walked off set. No drama, no slogan, just presence. Because in a world that still tries to define women by silence, Jasmine Crockett had chosen a different legacy: to speak, to reveal, to persist, and to never again ask permission to tell the truth. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.